Hello and welcome to the I3 lecture series hosted by the Masters in Digital Photography program. At the School of Visual Arts, we are thrilled to have photographer Adam Pape as tonight's guest speaker. Originally from Virginia, Adam is currently based in New York City. He holds an MFA from Yale University and teaches at SUNY Purchase College. After moving to New York City in 2011, he began making pictures in the neighborhoods of Washington Heights and Inwood. This body of work became his first monograph, Dyckman Haze, published by MACK Books in 2018. The book was featured in Le Monde magazine, Photo District News, Paper Journal, GUP magazine, and Book Forum. We were talking a little bit with Adam before signing on here, and just discussing the very interesting ways in which the work can be seen as connecting to classic New York City work, such as Ouija, you know, the kind of eeriness and noirish feel of the images, or as contemporary experimental work that is somewhere between documentary and theater, you know, pictures that are participatory and are performative and are being lit and directed by Adam. So we should have a very interesting discussion and presentation tonight. I want to mention that Dyckman Haze went on to be selected a shortlist winner for the Paris Photo Aperture Foundation Photo Book Awards. And photographs were also included in Aperture Gallery's exhibition Delirious Cities. Adam continues to work as an editorial photographer with commissions from the New Yorker magazine, The Fader, Art in America, and Harper's Magazine. Please help me welcome Adam Pape to our lecture series.
Hey everybody, thank you so much, Jaime, for the introduction, and thank you to SVA and the Masters of Digital Photography program for having me here. I moved to New York in 2011, and shortly after that, I mean, I'd lived in Chicago beforehand, I'd lived in Baltimore before that, and I kind of thought that I would have an easy transition into the city. And unfortunately, like, I experienced a tragedy very early on and lost a dear friend in a bicycle accident. And I think there was something kind of coupled with that and moving to this new place that left a strong feeling of uncertainty. But I think installed like more feelings of maybe gratitude and needing to take in every moment in a certain way within the city, but also realizing that the city was an extreme vehicle for change in a way that I just could not have expected. And the first neighborhood where I moved to was in Harlem at 125th and Broadway. And I quickly found myself moving along the green spaces in that neighborhood, mainly along Riverside Drive, and then moving further north. So this was a picture I made in a community garden that I worked in. I was still using a 4x5 view camera at that time, and it felt like a necessary tool in that moment for both kind of embracing certain types of landscape, but also for maybe a certain type of precision. And it slowed me down. It also allowed me to kind of begin to kind of spur on certain conversations with the people that I met during that time and being a new transplant to that city. This is Yosef. This gentleman would kind of come to the spot around like 168th Street or close to that area along Riverside. And he would tell me about this hawk that would visit him and doing these stretches. And I would ask him to kind of like hold and for long enough to focus and be able to make one exposure. And I also found that like the landscape was so different than from where I'd been used to seeing in Chicago. You know, going from the flat prairies to suddenly feeling a certain shift and feeling very small in a new way, like not just necessarily the buildings, but if you're familiar to that area around, especially the 125th 1 train where that stops, you know, just that huge dip in the landscape in which you have the train emerge and stop way above ground and then re-enter the ground at the other end. And I felt like it was underneath those train tracks and looking along the Hudson to the Palisades and kind of feeling this intense shift in that sense. And I found that there was, I guess Columbia University has a small campus for science and various like nature experiments along those lines. And I tried all I could to figure a way to get over there through phone calls and emails, but I just showed up to where the bus was supposed to pick up students, got on with my tripod, and then they drove me over into New Jersey, into the Palisades. And then that became kind of my way to then, I would just like walk off campus and then into the nature, since I didn't have a car. And it was just an easy and free way to kind of find a certain type of escape. And that kind of began these sort of explorations in that sense. And then also moving further north into Manhattan, into Fort Tryon and Inwood Parks. This is an early picture I made of this gentleman, Raphael. He was memorizing certain notes on these books, and he would step away and try to recount them out loud, and going back and forth in that manner. And then these gentlemen here practicing mixed martial arts. But a book that was really meaningful to me, even before I moved to New York, was this one, All That Solid Melts into Air by Marshall Berman. Berman is born and raised in the Bronx. He actually taught at CUNY City College up until he died not too long ago. And in this book, he kind of makes this hard argument for modernity and what it meant. And this was published in the early 80s. But in it, he kind of argues for the importance of both the conflict and talks about a lot of the potential violence and things to that extent within a modern expansion, but also about all the benefits and the art that then was made from it. And he does this through talking about the changes from 3 different cities, Paris, St. Petersburg, and New York. But it was really within like the story that he told in Paris that really resonated with me. In it, he goes through a couple poems of Baudelaire's, but the main one was Loss of a Halo. And in this poem, it's kind of a strange one, but it begins with this sort of narrator in like either a dive bar or a brothel of some kind, basically a place that you wouldn't expect to see a saintly person. And in walks this poet, and the narrator says, like, friend, how could you possibly be here? And where is your halo? And the poet begins to tell him, like, oh, the craziest thing, I was trying to cross one of these new boulevards, and the traffic was just moving so fast, and I'm running for my life. And my halo blows off my head, and it goes into the gutter. And then the poet kind of like says to himself, he's like, and then I said to myself, look for the silver lining. I can now walk around incognito, doing whatever nasty things I like, indulging my vices just as lesser mortals do. And here I am, just like you, as you see. And Berman really makes this amazing argument for the fact that like the boulevard itself is what's changed the poet. And the poet has been changed by the street in that moment. And just like so much of the city in that time in Paris, it's the boulevard had cut through so many neighborhoods. But it was also this, I feel like these pointing to the fact that art itself had been modified and could also begin to address things that no longer might have seemed too banal or even too, nasty or things to that extent that shouldn't have poetry written about it. But Berman, I feel like, also points out that the street itself had become a stage, especially for the public, that the public that may not have been seen in these dense neighborhoods that the boulevard had suddenly cut through, these people could now occupy this space, that they could stop traffic. And in that sense, I think became much more of a significant political force in a new way that cities hadn't necessarily allowed for before. So I like this idea of this poet losing his halo. So I have this photograph here by Philip Lorca, Decorcia, this man feeling as if he had been maybe lost a little bit more than a halo in a moment. But there's this element of obviously theatricality that Decorcia is so good at installing with using various off-camera lighting, sometimes in very everyday scenes. But I feel like similar to the poet, this kind of image points out that we can go along our way in the city, sometimes being absorbed so much in our constant everyday movements that we have forgotten maybe the people around us, or that we have forgotten, or we're no longer even paying attention what step we're taking. And then suddenly we can be thrust out of that sort of monotony and into like a new state of consciousness in a certain way. And I feel like Decorcia does such a great job of installing that, especially with this sort of cinematic lighting and elevating the everyday in a way that we normally only see maybe when the light is catching the perfect bit of glass or something to that extent. But then, of course, Decorcia isn't the first person, within New York City. We can go all the way back to the photographs by Jacob Riis, bringing magnesium flares into the various tenement housings in Manhattan. And then also we can look not to New York, but to Paris with Versailles, and really emphasizing the, beautiful nocturnal light and the kind of theater that creates as well. And then these sets of portraits from Walker Evans, secret camera on the subway sort of portraits that I find really stunning. There's this element of just like being able to witness a portrait in which someone feels fully absorbed into whatever they're kind of going on of that day, what it means to kind of just be in a state of transportation or in between kind of within the subway. But the photographer that really meant a lot to me, especially discovering him, discovering this book shortly after moving to New York, was Roy Decorcia. And then the book, The Sweet Flypaper of Life, his collaboration with Langston Hughes. This was recently republished. I highly recommend, if you can get your hands on a copy of that. It is not that expensive and is totally worth the buy. But unfortunately, my copy that I got when I first moved here, since the original was upwards of $400, I had to settle for a water damaged copy of the large scale version. So that's what these slides are from. But I was so taken with this story. The story that Hughes writes for Decorcia's pictures is one in which an angel has come to this woman and has told her that it's time to, St. Peter is calling you home. And the woman begins to explain to the angel what her day-to-day life is. And in this day-to-day, explanation, you begin to see her relations to her children, to her neighbors, to other elements of the city. And Hughes' writing ends up being this kind of like really delicate thread stitching these images together and kind of unifying what might have been seen as disparate images within a neighborhood and turning it into a almost kind of mystical or spiritual story. And the story ends with the woman telling the angel that I can no longer, I can't leave because I'm stuck in this sweet flypaper of life. And of course, you get the kind of 3 dots at the end that maybe means she does end up leaving, or her words go on in a different way. But I feel like there was something about installing a certain heightened sense of spirituality to the monotony of the city or the everyday going on within a neighborhood. And that felt like something I wanted to begin to see if I could hold a candle to that sort of sensibility. So I finally got a full-time job. I was, working during the day so I could make pictures basically nights and weekends. And that was what began to push me to kind of come back to Northern Manhattan and begin making pictures in the twilight hours. And I also saved up and I bought a DSLR. And this allowed me to kind of have a little bit more flexibility than what the view camera allowed for within the nighttime views, and began to kind of wander in and around these paths during these hours. And finding like moments like these where it was like an area where branches and Christmas trees had just kind of either been dumped by the park or by the neighborhood, but kind of became this almost surreal gesture or a certain type of explosion of animated branches that are almost reaching up for this young man running back up the steps. And as I spent more time there, I wanted to begin to have a better understanding and research into the space that I was making pictures. So this is archival imagery of the cloisters being built, which is a museum of medieval art inside the Fort Tryon Park. And the property itself that became the park was purchased by John D. Rockefeller, who's seen as kind of a philanthropic gesture. And he had acquired all of the this medieval art collection from the sculptor George Gray Barnard. So Barnard had acquired most of these pieces, I think it was from Europe, like shortly before places like Italy or France no longer would allow them to be exported to other countries. And he had sold it all off to John D. Rockefeller. So these pieces of various churches or monasteries, you know, literally began to become the building blocks for this museum. And I find it so fascinating to think about this landscape that, you know, obviously once had been occupied by native people to New York City and to North America, that it was a sort of fishing ground for a lot of these native people. And now there's this sort of like importing of European history literally into the landscape itself. So it's almost this sort of strange, like somewhat anti-modern gesture, like of this sort of mixture of time periods, but also this sort of colonial gesture in that sense too, of trying to put another history into a landscape where it never existed. And the park itself was designed and built by the Olmsted firm. This was no longer Frederick Law Olmsted himself, but this was his children. Frederick Law Olmsted was the creator of Central Park and Prospect Park, but I believe the park still held a lot of the same ideology that Olmsted held, mainly that, you know, the citizen was to be completely transported from the city once entering the park, that the park itself was not to be too pristine, that there was supposed to be a sense of wildness to it. But yet it seems every path and every rock is in some sense intentional. So, you know, this is a painting by Thomas Cole, the Oxbow, and I feel that there's this sort of sense of the Hudson River School that is totally being embodied in this park, if anything, trying to generate views like this, you know, and I feel like there's something about this painting that also points back to Olmsted, both having the sort of idealistic view that we see out into the light on the right across the Oxbow of the river, but that we also have this mangled tree and this threatening storm and this kind of sense of like both wildness and decay in a certain sense. So I feel it makes perfect sense that then you would have a view like this within the park, right? This one, you simply just walking along and then you have trees on all sides, but then you have this amazing clearing through the trees and you can see the Palisades across the Hudson. I was able to make this picture by kind of hanging out in the park through a thunderstorm and basically waiting for the clouds to dissipate after the rain had finished, and luckily caught like the last bit of light with the clouds in this state. But I feel like there's also this thing with the water and how water hangs in the air along the Hudson in a very different way than it does anywhere else in this country. And that felt very special. But also in the sense of this sort of like manufactured view, it then became no surprise to find out that John D. Rockefeller had actually purchased all the land across the Hudson, and that it kind of almost turned the park into this sort of diorama. I mean, almost in a sense similar to a photograph, right? That the park became this specific way in which to view the land. So, part of my experimentations in this park was ones with landscape and trying to figure out other ways to expand on what views could be. This one was made through looking through, leaves kind of surrounding a bit of water and kind of allowing for that reflection to create a bit of disorientation. And then also bringing small flashes into the park and trying to elevate these spaces. This one was made, I found this homemade dollhouse that was seated on top of this stump right there. And for the life of me, I could not bring myself to touch it. It almost felt as if there were spirits of some kind living inside of it. But it also felt like a perfect sort of idea of almost like an Alice in Wonderland, kind of like shrunken house, that, this world that I'm trying to make, or through multiple frames, is to kind of shift it outside of the city. And as if the city itself had almost been shrunken on top of this stump. And then the flashes also became this way to sort of like elevate some of the people I met in the park at this twilight time. This is Beverly showing me her braids. And this is David and Damon. If you can't tell, they're twins. They have kind of the same jawline. But I love this sort of also strange gesture of kind of having someone's profile be duplicated. And then Jorge here with his flute, almost kind of as a Pan-like character, like enticing everybody into dance or something to that extent. And then in moments like these where, you know, again, it was just kind of like through slow meetings and goings on. This was a fellow who was a part of a group of guys exercising on the bars late at night. And he was more than willing to meet my challenge of how long do you think you can hold upside down for? So this, you know, allowed me the opportunity to kind of light the scene and create something that feels as if gravity has not taken hold of him quite yet, or that his face is moments away from impact with the mats. And scenes like this one as well, this young woman was doing these stretches, and I think just simply trying to, you know, open up her hips or things to that extent. And I asked her, like, would you mind if I, you know, relit this situation, or would you mind doing this again? So it's kind of maybe part of these pictures becoming like not quite stagings or maybe somewhat near documents, as Jaime kind of pointed out, that, you know, asking these individuals to repeat something that I had seen them do once before. And then simply scenes like this with Amanda and her boyfriend in the foreground and their friends in the background, where, you know, asking them to, if I minded making some pictures, and them being completely unaware, uncaring as to what I did in that moment. So it was simply, you know, just being able to move the flashes around, and I think just them being maybe absorbed more in text messaging or each other. But Amanda has also become, you know, a lot of my interactions with people I meet in the park then go back to Instagram, or where I'm sharing the pictures. So it's like I've seen Amanda multiple times, or she's come to either like picture or times in which these pictures have been shared at either, I think, for the Aperture show or a book launch at one point. And then this gentleman here, Sabas, he, you know, I think this is where the flash kind of begins to generate even a different genre, you know, feeling as if the flash is almost a physical effect in some ways. Like you can feel him kind of almost being shook, maybe due to like the slow shutter drag, or certain other combinations that I was using, but trying to generate different feels throughout the sort of sequence of the book. And also finding, you know, moments like this, or individuals with this beautiful plume of white hair, which acts as a perfect contrast to the dark background. And then black and white became to be this other thing that became really important to the body of work. Like it's, you know, I try to distance myself from certain elements of nostalgia, but instead see black and white as being this way of distancing yourself from reality, that, you know, we see the world in color. So it would make more sense if I was to build a body of work that was about a certain type of transformation away from the city, that black and white would kind of lend itself to that transformation. And I also love how black and white takes away a season, right? That you can't quite tell whether it's winter or summer within this sort of edit, that everything's kind of within a certain type of silver purgatory, because you no longer have the kind of tones of warm and cool. And it also sort of takes away that time of day, like everything is within a certain potential silver twilight or something to that extent. And then elevating other images into complete otherworldliness, like this sinkhole I found along the Hudson. And then these cairns that this fellow Ulysses was setting up day after day, and being able to kind of catch that atmosphere of the snow coming through because of the flash. And again, continuing to make portraits along the way. Some people maybe searching for a bit of solitude, or, you know, a different sense of community along the shore, like this couple fishing. But, you know, another artist that I kept coming back to, not a photographer, but a draftsman, an architectural draftsman, is Hugh Ferris. And I became fascinated with his drawings because of the use and depictions of electronic light. These were made in the early 1920s. And some of these buildings were ones that were constructed, and other ones were complete hypotheticals. but I felt like it pointed to a certain creative energy in darkness and what darkness could be. That it's like, for better or for worse, you know, darkness allows to elevate our imagination, that we can see multitudes in the darkness. And I felt that he was beginning, I mean, he went on through the Depression to design these sort of like futuristic looking cities. And I feel like really push the element of imagination and sort of potential within architecture and design. And it felt like maybe this was a bit of how I wanted to talk about the city within the park, or maybe trying to expand on that sense of what darkness could be. So along that same idea of nighttime in New York, I, shortly after grad school, I showed a portfolio of some of this early work that I had made in Inwood to a few of the photo editors at the New Yorker. And I was lucky enough to work with the editor, Thea Traff, and she proposed the idea of a photo series based on nighttime jobs in New York. So the kind of cover image there, this was made at the Fulton Fish Market. And I was very captivated by the fact at the Fulton Fish Market in the Bronx, how everybody that worked there seemed to have one of these hooks. And this hook was used, you know, a lot of the time to grab, you know, whole fish by the gills, but it could also be used to grab garbage or grab multitudes of bags or who knows what else. But then when you're not using the hook, it would go back up onto the shoulder. And this gentleman, this jacket, I guess, wasn't too new, but the hook had just etched this like perfect line into his back. And it felt like this amazing image of someone being marked by their own labor. And I feel like at this fish market, I had a very naive sense of people bringing in their local catch. But these fish were coming through from everywhere from Alaska to South America to Australia. And this is all being then shopped around from 11 a.m. or from 12 a.m. to 7 a.m. So grocery store attendants, restaurants, people were coming through and checking out everyone's fish. This is these like what looks like tree trunks or chunks of swordfish that the gentleman there is weighing. And then to try to add some levity to it, we photographed, I came up with the idea of photographing a drag show. But instead of only the show, we photographed Pixie Aventura getting ready in her apartment in Hell's Kitchen. And this kind of became this nice little like time keep to the edit itself. So this was one of several pictures of Pixie. And this is a judge at night court. This is at Casino World, further out closer to Rockaway. I wasn't allowed to photograph any of the customers, but I could photograph any of the servers or people to that extent. So this young woman explained to me she thinks that they keep the air conditioning on pretty heavily in order to keep the older customers caffeinated. So she was pouring out lots of cups of coffee to people on the slot machines. This is at Amy's Bakery in Queens, rolling out baguettes. Department of Sanitation. I feel like I got so many stories from the gentleman that was driving me behind this garbage truck the whole night. The one that still sticks with me to today is, who do you think the circus calls when one of their elephants dies? And then I just had this horrible image of a kind of terrifying Joel Sternfeld of a dead elephant and a garbage truck somehow coming into combination. But it's just fascinating the number of what these gentlemen encounter day to day, as well as just the amount of garbage that they're moving every single day and every single night. But I was constantly trying to keep up with them, running with like a flash on a stand, and I would try to set something up and continue to make pictures along the way. This is Pixie again, putting on eyeshadow. This is about 4 a.m. in the Flower District, kind of similar to the fish market, but better smells. This is doing a ride along with the U.S. Coast Guard, and they have to keep and monitor the Staten Island ferry because it's considered a soft target for terrorism. So since the ferry runs 24 hours, they also have to go out at night these gentlemen asked me if I got seasick, and I said, I don't know. So a lot of the time they were trying to, I think, test that by doing these like random curves in and around the boat. Luckily, it came out to a good picture, and I did not get seasick. This is major cuteness here. This is at the Animal Care Center in East Harlem, and this kitten is getting its dewormer. They are also 24 hours, since they are the only ones that are registered to take animals from the police. So even while I was there, they had a dog that came through that had survived and was okay, but had been shot by its owner, and the police had to bring it in. I was not allowed to take pictures of anything like that, though, because it was part of a current police investigation. At least that's what they told me. And this is at a sleep clinic, putting on sensors before going to bed. This is back at Casino World, one of the security guards. This is Pixie finally on stage. I love the kind of like dividing line that she becomes on stage, where you have the pure enjoyment of everyone on the left side of the frame, you know, infatuated with her. And then you have this sort of like apathetic boredom by the ladies in the background. And she did this performance with Monet Exchange, who I think went on to Drag Race. And I can't remember where or how that settled out for Monet. But I think Pixie still does this show called The Help. I mean, obviously not anymore due to COVID, but, and this was at Therapy Bar. I highly recommend it if things ever go back to that point anytime soon. And then finally, the last picture that the series was done at the Good Samaritan Suicide Hotline. So the hotline, the location of the hotline is to always remain secret, and as well as the identity of everybody who is a volunteer there. None of these people are getting paid, and they are there 24/7. So I had to kind of come up with an idea of like how to show an individual without actually showing their face in any way. So they had these dividers between volunteers. And I was able to kind of like isolate my light onto one of those dividers in order to create this silhouette. So after making that body of work, as well as I was still shooting in Dyckman, or along Dyckman in Inwood in Fort Tryon. And this is after graduate school and in and around 2016 or so. And the thing that kept bringing me back, and maybe what started the work, is this strange infestation of skunks that I found in this park. There seemed to be a way larger number of these animals than I had ever seen in my life. And it felt, you know, what could be a better embodiment of these sort of black and white pictures that I was making in a park than this sort of black and white animal that seemed to be, you know, coming around and scavenging on every little bit that was left over. This one is eating a very last bits of what I think was some birthday cake. You can see the bit of icing left over on its forehead. This one kind of creeping along with that little bit of reflection in the eye. And then these four young ones that almost feel like a strange pack of hyenas to me in a certain way. I love how the one in the center is completely eclipsed by its own tail. And I don't know. But I think the one other thing that they kept doing, especially with this sort of like reflectiveness in the eyes, is I felt like I kept finding these sort of white little jewels in the darkened landscape, like the moon here, as well as the, you know, the street lamps that would appear, and how they like perfectly lined up with the, you know, the animal's eyes lighting up due to the flashes I was using. So it kind of became this sort of bouncing ball that would kind of appear in and out of different pictures, like this one again with the moon behind the trees. But then you also have ones like this, you know, I feel like like the skunk adds this sort of sense of humor, I feel like, to what could be very dark and noir and seedy pictures. Instead, it's, you know, this bit of shock. And I feel like in a lot of ways, it's similar to what I was talking about, of kind of like, you know, being shocked out of what you think is normal what you think you're supposed to be doing in a park or in any part of the city. And suddenly you see this animal that is brought you out of whatever sort of sense of normalcy or reality you think you're supposed to have. And I really loved this idea of this animal feeling as if it's shocked, as well as its sphincter kind of lining up with the lens in that way. And also kind of, it felt perfect again to kind of shoot this animal that could shoot back as well. And also to cut off any questions beforehand, I have not been sprayed by any skunks at this point. They did not baptize me in any way to become one with them. So to at least answer any of those questions or doubts. But I also loved how these sort of moments of the wildlife between like other people within the park, like this raccoon scavenging here, as well as like this young man kind of witnessing this skunk coming around the lamppost. And I felt it was important to kind of have these, because I feel like, especially with this one, with this Melvin and his dog Samson, this became this sort of moment of exchange or welcome within like one animal acknowledging the person. But I also loved how Samson didn't have a collar on. So you're also a bit unsure as to like what the animal's relationship is to the man in this moment. As well as including this one where you have this kind of moment of play between two dogs that then seems a little bit more aggressive or violent. So again, that sort of push and pull between wild and domesticated within the park, which I feel like is again, like points to this sort of sense of like in-betweenness, or, that the park represents, that it isn't quite wild or domesticated, that it's manicured at times, but we're not quite sure as to how to always interpret that space. And I felt like this image here feels a bit more of that broken tree within the Thomas Cole painting. This is a rotten pumpkin that I found after the snows had melted in the springtime. And it just felt like this, again, this sort of point to the less beautiful elements of nature, or also just this sort of strangeness of, vegetation suddenly being deflated in this way. But the other thing I found, especially with a lot of the young people that I met in these kind of twilight hours, is that they came there in a lot of ways to escape the eyes on the street, both family or maybe other relatives in that sense, or even police, that it's like the park offered a kind of like solace. In the park at night offered this sort of protective realm in that sense. And I think in that sense, it also allowed for them to perform in another way, right? This sort of public space allowed for them, away from their parents, to start trying on certain adult behaviors. And that being like, one, smoking cigarettes, but also smoking pot and smoking hookah. So especially with the element of smoking pot, I thought there was this, obviously the punning between them and the skunks felt perfect. But it also felt like the same sort of sense of what Olmsted's original intentions were, which was kind of this sense of elevation, to go to the park to be transformed away from the city. And it felt maybe important for them to kind of take on a certain mind-altering substance in the process. So I would go between like making pictures like these of the skunks. And again, like I'm also standing out, like I'm using a 300mm lens at times to photograph these skunks. I have multiple flashes off camera, so I'm standing out. And a lot of the times I've kind of become known as the skunk guy in the park. But then I would go through and I would meet other folks as I was doing that, like this one here of Tony. He was showing me how to blow the river along this kind of stone chessboard. But I guess I used this as an opportunity to, like, he was willing to repeat the gesture over and over again. And maybe this is kind of an interesting point to the students, but you don't really know what will happen as a gesture gets repeated and how that can kind of transform the photograph. And I really enjoy how the smoke is only partially there, like showing up between his nose and the brim of the hat, but instead it kind of becomes this almost like reverent or sensual gesture to the stone of the chessboard, the chess table in the park. It's almost like as if there's like a certain ritual that's being acted out. And then this one here of Mercedes showing me her French inhale. She's blocking the wind, and in order to do that, holding up her hand. So it feels like there's almost this like call out into the darkness. And this one of this fellow, Victor, where the smoke is just completely kind of wrapped around his head and has almost become like a second face in that way. So yeah, again and again, trying to find more and more of these sort of relationships between young folk and interacting in these moments kind of away from their parents, but also finding this sort of haze of the smoke in other places like this one with this fellow Quinn, his buddy Alex, that would fish along the Hudson. I think they set this fire mostly for me to kind of show off a little bit, but it ended up making a pretty good picture, so I went along with it. And then finding kind of bits of romance too. It's like a hookah smoking and a bit of flirting. And then this sort of romantic element of these azaleas blooming and this bit of water left over. And then a bit more than flirting with this couple that were willing to make out for a picture. And then this image is really meaningful to me. It kind of goes back to like the block parties that you would have in the Bronx, in which people would rewire street lamps so they could have power for like speakers and things to that extent. But I like that it points to, again, the public kind of taking this space and changing it into what they need it to be. That, you know, before any mayor puts like iPhone chargers along the sidewalk there, they've already changed the street lamp into what they need. And that I love the kind of iPhone charger cable resting with a bodega coffee cup. And I think this sort of the same, again, to harken back to the sort of like Olmsted sensibility, that, you know, he maybe wanted to create the space that wasn't wild or kind of, you know, was somewhere in between these two things, but he probably couldn't or would not have necessarily liked the idea of like the natural fauna of the area, you know, finding their place in it as like skunks do in and around eating garbage, or that teenagers, you know, would find their way to transcend the city, but maybe it wouldn't be the same way that he would have anticipated. So then with some of this work already developed, I showed an edit of it to Michael Mack, and he agreed to make a book of it. And I worked with the designer, Morgan Ashcroft Brown, and she came up with this cover design, which I felt, you know, it took me a moment, but I now register how genius it is, in the sense that with this picture of Natasha, you know, dancing in this sinkhole on the other end, and then with no title on either side, you're not quite sure as to which end to open the book and what is up or what's down. So there's this sort of element of disorientation that you have when looking or picking up the book. And then with the first picture within my sequence, it was the same one that I opened with, where you have the train that's moving along Manhattan heading north. And it's kind of the first picture to kind of orient you within the city, but it's this moment of descent where you're going into the darkened corner that's over to the left. And the first beginning of the sequence became like these sort of reverent, bucolic landscapes that then would suddenly shift into the full bleed that would again be this sort of shock moment. And then continuing on with more of these sort of portraits and moving in and out of the full bleed into diptychs like these two, and into both using the full bleed and the bordered image, in which it feels like Beverly is kind of looking into this out of focus iPhone. And the title Dyckman Haze, my idea behind it was that Dyckman Street is the main dividing line, or is the dividing line between the two neighborhoods I was shooting in, both Washington Heights and Inwood. But it harkens back to the Dutch farmer that used to own the property up there. The farmhouse is still preserved to this day on Dyckman Street. And I liked that it pointed towards this sort of sense of colonialism that, you know, the Dutch, even supposedly where they bought the island of Manhattan from the native people, is, you know, the stone that they did that deal around is still in Inwood Park. And it feels like there's sort of this point to this history, both, you know, the imported history by John D. Rockefeller into the cloisters, but also to the native people that were once there, along with all of the, along with the Dutch colonial settlement. And then haze, I feel like, is the contemporary intoxicant. It's the, you know, it's the strain of marijuana that can be grown in the Heights. It also points to the atmosphere, I think, along with that is so prevalent within so many of the pictures too. You know, the kind of hazy viewing, but also the hazy view you might have in other states of mind too. And then, so this is the final sequence within the book, and kind of my argument for the students here towards maybe a certain level of procrastination, or at least working up to the last minute. I began this body of work in 2013 or 2012, and I did not end it until we were on, I think, in July, and we went to press I didn't end shooting until July, and then we went to press in September. So this was one of the maybe oldest pictures in the edit of Morel. But then this picture of Ramses kind of levitating, I was not able to make this picture until I believe it was like June. So I felt that this was the perfect ending, kind of in some ways, that this would be the last figure I wanted within the sequence, in which it felt that this young man who was so good at doing backflips off these bars was caught in this moment of levitation. And within this frame, it kind of feels as if his friend is looking up at him in disbelief as he's beginning to kind of fly outside of the park. And that, you know, this would then be the kind of escape from the park, where we go to like another aerial view. And then the sort of vista that John D. Rockefeller tried to preserve slowly being encroached upon. And then the trains along Riverdale kind of moving further back up north out of the city. And then this kind of last image here, in which I like this sort of circle of light as being, you know, maybe another portal, or maybe a portal that's even being blocked, or it's kind of the city's, you know, mark back over nature, the trees in that moment. But yeah, so that is my talk as it goes. I'll stop sharing my screen now, and I definitely would be happy to answer any questions you may have.
Wow, Adam, thank you. What an eloquent talk and introduction to your work. From your point of view, I mean, the idea of haze, so poetic, so well chosen on so many levels. Also, the haze of a mirage, something that is difficult to understand exactly what you're looking at and how that is reflected in the book. As we wait for some questions to come in through the chat, I wonder if you would mind speaking a little bit more about the particulars of the New Yorker Commission, and just in the sense of how did you choose your subjects for that commission, and how many nights shooting did it take to complete that type of, you know, detail?
Yeah, so it was a collaborative effort between me and Thea. She was an amazing editor. I don't know if I will ever be that lucky again as far as to have that amount of collaborative effort, but I think the Fulton Fish Market was one that I really wanted to do. The Flower District was one that I kind of had a night off, but my sleep schedule, that was the other thing, was really out of whack for 2 weeks. And I, you know, trying to take that night off and just do nothing didn't really make any sense. So I went there. Thea had come up with the Coast Guard. She had also suggested the Animal Care Center. I mean, there was other things that we really wanted to do that we just couldn't find. Like, we were thinking about, like, would there be some element of showing a funeral home, or kind of what that is like, you know, 24 hours. I think, you know, we did some stuff with a air control center, but those didn't really work out. So it was a lot of back and forth and trial and error. And that was it was about 2 weeks worth of shooting. You know, there was maybe a couple breaks within that. And then every morning I would come back home and I would download the card and then do a quick edit and send that off to them of about 20 pictures. And then, you know, it was the dead of summer and I did not have air conditioning. So I was just like trying my hardest to have like some really sweaty sleep from, you know, 9 a.m. to 1 p.m. or something to that extent. So it was, and I think the sleep center was like one of the last places I went and photographed. And I remember asking the nurse there, I was just like, so how am I supposed to do this? Like, how am I supposed to do this better? And she's just like, there is no way. You're not supposed to be awake at this time. Like, it's just kind of like, great. So no chance. But yeah, I think, you know, it was a great opportunity. I'm not, did that answer your question, or was there more particulars to that?
No, that's a great answer. I was just curious, you know, how much they help you produce, and did you have a couple nights to really hustle, or did you said a couple weeks? And so just interested in the general shape of a commission like that. And I think you gave us a great answer. I have a question here from James Prochnick, and he says, I love the book. The pictures seem to maintain a 4:5 aspect ratio, but you mentioned using a DSLR, which is usually a 2:3. Is that a medium format DSLR, or are you cropping for that ratio? And your control of artificial lighting is so beautiful. Are your flashes typically on our own light stands or handheld? Same with your camera. Are you using a tripod for Dyckman Haze work, or mostly handheld? And I didn't catch what year you finished the work, and how did you get your work in front of Michael Mack? Okay, so a whole bunch of questions.
Yeah.
I'm happy to repeat if you need a reminder.
I think I can do it. So technical question, the camera's a D800. And what I loved about that camera is that it would immediately crop within the 4:5 ratio that I was used to using. And I would just set my settings to use it within that ratio. That's what I kind of felt comfortable. I thought it lent it sort of that formality that I was always attracted to. And I didn't really mind what I was losing on either side. I also found when I would try to crop after that I was always kind of regretting it. And I felt that the settings that it had for the camera, it worked to my benefit to have that pre-set up. I am using tripod and handheld. Probably for the portraits, more handheld than tripod. The flash, you know, we were joking earlier, and I was saying how it's like, you know, for the most part, I'm not working with an assistant. I'm just a one-man band. So I have a backpack normally that has like a light stand. Maybe I have a strap around a tripod. I would take the light stand out and normally attach a flash to that. And I got some radio slaves from one of my old employers from when I first moved here. He was kind enough to donate them to my cause, I guess. So those, you know, it's like a slow start between kind of acquiring these different pieces to begin making the work. And then there was times where it was kind of realizing that the flash was not necessary, and trying to figure out how to, you know, still get similar effects, but not use that as well. So it was, I mean, it's a big push and pull. And then the time frame, so it was, started shooting it or kind of figuring it out in 2011, 2012, or the 4:5 stuff I showed early on was 2011. I think the DSLR stuff started in 2012. I finished it in 2018. And then with seeing Michael Mack, it was, you know, lucky enough that I was able to meet Stanley Waluka Wanabwa in graduate school. And, you know, grad school is a very strange time, as I'm sure so many of you guys know. And I think we had this studio visit in which I had a bunch of new work on the walls. And then I just had this small box of some of the Dyckman Haze work that I had started before grad school. And I showed him that box, and he's like, this looks interesting, keep me posted. And then I think like later on, it was, you know, I sent him a PDF, and then I think he forwarded that on to Michael. And so that was, I mean, I think I think we all count our blessings and how lucky we are in some ways. And I think that's one of them, where those circumstances lined up that way.
Absolutely. And, you know, part of it is just to be ready, right? When the opportunity comes to, you know,
yeah,
we wait and we try to be ready for those opportunities. But you've certainly put in years of work into this beautiful body of work. And
I would say that also to the grad school thing, or since we're kind of speaking to that in one way, that I think using that time also to not perfect work. Like I was actually told my first semester that's like, you already know this work is good. Why are you still showing it to us? Mm-hmm. I think that was maybe hard to hear in that moment. But you then know that it's kind of like, it's time to kind of expand out from that. And I think what that offered me was maybe not finishing anything in a state, but realizing I had many different sort of projects or potential projects, or even just ruling out other ideas that I did not. I know now that it's like, okay, don't waste your time on that. So, you know, I mean, that's maybe my statement to graduate students, is to experiment as much as you can, even as painful as it may be to have those problem shoots or things to that extent critted.
Thank you. Let me move on to a question from our department chair, Tom Ash. He says, thank you, Adam. I really appreciate your work and all the thoughtful references and influences. True. What was the process of researching these? Did these come early in the process or later?
I'd say Marshall Berman's book was something that was given to me by a mentor of mine in Chicago, Daniel Bauer. And it was such a strange text, and I've never heard anybody else kind of like, other than architects that I've met in passing, that have referenced Berman. And maybe there's other artists or people in this lecture that have heard of him before. But that kind of came early on, but I didn't really know what to do with it yet. And I read the book when I was still living in Chicago, and I think there was maybe some, you know, this sort of shift or this interest in the city, or trying to make pictures in New York. Making pictures in New York is a very difficult thing. I feel like every image you can make here in some ways has been influenced by either previous photographers or movies or anything to that extent. So but it felt like a right challenge, and maybe that kind of pushed me in that way. I mean, Philip Lorca Decorcia, I've always admired that work. I think that was kind of always in the peripheral to some extent. But, you know, I feel like also moving here, I found myself trying to watch more New York movies for the first time. I remember moving here also feeling very down and watching Rosemary's Baby, and kind of like, yeah, there's just fucked up shit going on in these buildings, like Satanism. Yeah, I guess like those were maybe other influences that I didn't talk about that were part of it. But, you know, I think, you know, we're always just trying to like fill our cup up with something, and maybe research applies directly to something, or those influences or those books or those articles that you're reading will apply to something later on. I don't know. Okay. I mean, is there something specific, Tom, that like?
No, that was perfect. Thank you.
We have a comment from Nelson Chan. Says, thanks, Adam. It's always great to hear you talk about your work in process. Sao Tanaka, she admits that she probably missed it, and I think she did when you talked about why you shoot in black and white.
I'd be happy to say it again. So, I mean, black and white, you know, this body of work, I kind of saw it as this, you know, I mean, there was a certain attraction to it, of course, in the beginnings, where it was like, okay, there's something about how the shadows are being interpreted. It kept making more and more sense to pursue or use either black and white film, or to then switch the files to black and white. But, you know, the sense of just like idea of transformation away from reality, as well as this sort of like weird purgatory between like spring and summer, while, you know, you're not really having those temperatures, I think is one of the parts that I really liked about how it came together in this sort of like world building, or however you want to call this book. That's kind of maybe my
actually
answer to that question.
From just to mention that there was another question from Susan Morlock, also about black and white, and I think you just answered or recapped again why the interest in black and white. I'm curious if you had a chance to make any work about COVID per se, or during this strange time, which is also a kind of haze for all of us to be, you know, sequestered in our homes for so long. You know, it's a brand new world. It's a haze. It dumps our sensibility to a certain extent, but it also sharpens it to other things, and the heaviness and the boredom, and you know, all of these things that we have to contend with. Did that motivate you at all to make new work, or?
I've been making pictures. Most of it, though, was kind of in the springtime where I was doing kind of these twilight walks or things to that extent. But I mean, the one thing that I kept becoming attracted to, which is no longer black and white, but just the certain red lights, both by emergency vehicles or police vehicles that were kind of lighting different scenes, and finding ways to kind of relate that to another body of work that I've been working on. I think, I mean, what's strange to me is that, you know, going out onto the street though, I'm finding that I'm still able to kind of make, you know, documentary style pictures in New York that, you know, I feel like there's still such a rush to get back to being on the street in some capacity, that there's still a presence there. People, I mean, especially just, I mean, I'm sure if I was photographing more in parks these days, you know, you would just see multitudes of people in those spaces. But I don't know if, you know, I think trying to point to any one thing and say that like, this is COVID or like, or things to that extent felt like it would be kind of a missing metaphor. I think there was certain things that influenced pictures I made, but I wouldn't say that it was like COVID per se. Mm-hmm. But I mean, we're also products of our times. Like I can't say that I'm not affected by it. I think any artist right now is affected by the current circumstances we live in.
Sure.
I guess though, I'm surprised maybe in the sense that, you know, I wear a mask when I go out and I will still approach people and have a chat, but I find that people are also still so starved for interaction that I'm still able to kind of have that sort of level, even though it might be at a distance and with a mask on, which is surprising. I feel like, you know, I think that's kind of the horrible part of COVID has been this sort of, you know, distancing. Like I hate the fact they call it social distancing when it's really, we're all so socially starved. And it really is physical distancing. It's not social distancing. And if anything, I think we need that social connection in order to maintain some sense of sanity or work against the haze of COVID. So, you know, and I think that's part of me also, just that ritual of trying to go out and walk and make frames and meet new people. And I'm glad that that still is able to exist in some sense, and that we haven't gotten so afraid that we're unwilling to even recognize another person on the street or chat with them in that sense.
Very true, very true. I mean, there's almost a certain sense of hostility sometimes. I less so now, but when things were really, really bad back at the end of March or April, even with my own neighbors in the building, I felt like there was a reluctance to, you know, come close. And these are people that I used to see every day in the common areas of the buildings, and people were like, you know, almost hostile to the possibility of human contact. It was very painful.
Yeah.
But you know, something that I also was very curious about, and this comes from my own sort of personal experience with publishing. I know that there's always battles that need to be, you know, sort of hashed out with publishers. They have a look for their books, and you have your own project. And what were some of the challenges you faced when you were, you know, working on Dyckman Haze, and what were some of the things you really truly wanted to keep, and some of the things that maybe a publisher like MACK wanted from you?
I'd say they were pretty giving in a lot of ways. I think, you know, maybe what you feel as like, you know, being relatively new out of graduate school, I was so used to seeing eyes and getting feedback all the time that there's, you know, even if it's negative feedback, it's still a certain type of feedback and a certain type of coddling, I think, that we get used to in that state. And you kind of are expecting feedback. And I think I'd say this even with the editors too, that there's not necessarily always you know, they're not going to give you a paragraph as to why one picture, why not another, or things to that extent. It's just going to be, these are our changes, what do you think, sort of thing. Or these are our selects, you know, what would you adjust? And I'd say like there was one picture in the New Yorker that was, I think, of the night court that I had made that I thought had potential, but ultimately I was like, you know, I really don't think this one is sending the right message. I would like to take it out. And they agreed with me, and that was, I think, a fair exchange. With MACK, I more or less, that the whole sequence I put together in a PDF, and I think there was 2 pictures that they took out, and I didn't miss them. Mm-hmm. And I think the cover design, I was a little unsure of, but I think I warmed a lot more to the idea of kind of like what that did for the book.
So they provided the designer. They basically appointed a designer to your project.
Yes, Morgan is their in-house designer. She works on all projects. I'm sorry, I do not know when she started, but she's very talented, and mm-hmm. I thank her so much for her work on that book. But yeah, they provided the designer, but again, like, I think to some extent, if you also, I think it takes all kinds. I think certain publishers, I'm sure, want something that is completely finished. You know, it's an easier thing to move along if you know all the intentions of what you want it to be. And I think there are other circumstances in which you shouldn't hold your project too tightly. And I think it's important sometimes to, at least, you know, to some degree, especially with like a concept to the cover or other sort of designs in that way, you know, it wasn't my ass on the line as much for them, in the sense that they still have to move these copies, and maybe they have a better sense of like what it means for somebody to be motivated to pick up a book. Mm-hmm. And, you know, I think that was kind of part of me where it's like, I need to let some of this go. And I think also, you know, when you're so intimate with a certain body of work, I think it's really important to understand what it means for it to be seen through somebody else's eyes. So there's a healthy sense of distance, but I think, you know, maybe also to your point of just being ready is like, you still need to be able to make certain calls and have intuition and other things and what you want. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm sorry, that's kind of vague, but...
No. It's. I think it's a very clear answer to the general scope of things. I mean, every publisher has an identity. You know, MacBooks certainly has a very strong brand. Their books, you know it. You see a MacBook, you know it's a MacBook, and it's different than an Aperture monograph, and it's different than a Untitled book, and it's different than, you know, La Fábrica or etc. So I understand. There is another follow-up question here from James Prochnik, and he says, what would you say to build rapport with the young people you were approaching at night with camera and flashes?
What built the rapport?
How did you build rapport? Yeah, what would you say to people, or how would you engage?
I mean, to me, as I said before, it was a lot about just kind of being visible. Like, it wasn't that I was, you know, sneaking around or anything to that extent, I guess. And, you know, I guess, you know, explain what it was I was doing, show them, you know, these are the pictures I made, and then it was, and then there was elements of exchange. It didn't always happen, but it would be like either sending pictures via Facebook or Instagram or WeTransfer or whatever for their own use or their own purpose in that sense. And that, I mean, I feel like certain people I would see again and other people I wouldn't. Like Tony was somebody that I would see often again. And it was always funny then, like, as I began to make these pictures, then I would have like a small edit on my phone, and then I would share them with maybe somebody else I was photographing, and they're like, "Oh God, that's Tony!" And then it was all like, funny, sort of like recognizing their friends and things to that extent.
Right. If you look at the list of participants here, do you recognize anybody of your subjects? Is anybody here that you photographed? It would be fun to hear from somebody if that was the case. I don't know if that's the case.
I don't think so. Okay. I'm sorry if I'm not recognizing anybody.
Just a stab in the dark here. I mean, yeah. And you mentioned you didn't really.
I just know I don't know Ephraim from the park, but I know Ephraim from other places. Hey.
All right. There is here one final comment, not a question, from Sydney Krantz, and Sydney says, "Many thanks, Adam. So great to hear about your work and your process." And I'm gonna borrow Sydney's words to say, thank you everybody for attending. And Adam, thank you for a stellar lecture. And we wish you well in all of your future endeavors, and please stay in touch with us. It's wonderful.
Thank you so much for having me, guys. Really appreciate it.